Hello, and thank you for listening. I'm Dr. Jane Clayton of the University of Surrey, and today I plan to tell you a story. But it's a story which is fact, not fiction, and it's about the life of a newly discovered member of the Paston family, Constance Paston, the illegitimate daughter of John Paston II. My research has revealed that despite her illegitimacy, Constance was acknowledged and cared for by the Pastons. I have found that she was raised by an uncle and aunt, grew up to marry for love a local gentleman, and that she had children and grandchildren of her own. I'll structure my talk so that we move chronologically through Constance's life, and I'll use PowerPoint to show you some of the letters and the two wills and some records of an 18th century antiquarian and a monumental brass, which reveal the story. Using this Paston pedigree, I'll briefly introduce you to the main characters in the story. At the top, Margaret Mautby Paston is the grandmother of Constance, in whose will she appears. Margaret was married, again at the top, to John Paston, now known as John Paston I, to distinguish him from his eldest son, Sir John Paston, or John Paston II, who is to the left, who was Constance's father. To the right of him is John Paston III, his younger brother, who, I believe, with his first wife, Marjorie Bruce Paston, adopted Constance and brought her up. Below John Paston II is Constance herself, and along the bottom, and in fact the same generation as Constance, though it doesn't appear so from this picture, the same generation as Constance, are John Paston III's children, who were really Constance's first cousins, but since she was probably raised with them, were effectively her brothers and sisters. It's wonderful that you've got it so big, because actually you can see, I didn't know it was going to be so large. You can actually see this letter very clearly. Now, our story begins with a love affair between a young girl and a knight. It's a secret liaison. We know about it because this letter from the Paston Letters collection was written in March 1478. It's from a young woman who signs herself Constance Reniforth. And you can probably see at the bottom there, Constance Reniforth. Although nowadays we might easily say her name as Rainford or Rainforth or Rainsford. Constance Reniforth was a girl from a gentry family, and she was writing this letter to her lover, Sir John Paston, now known as John Paston II. He was about 36, and he had had considerable experience with women, whereas Constance Reniforth was probably much younger. In this letter, Constance Reniforth hatches a plot to outwit her kinsfolk so that she can spend time with her lover. She asks John Paston to send a manservant to her. She is going to give the man a letter destined for her cousin, which appears to come from her uncle, asking for Constance to go with the man to join the uncle so that her cousin will let her go. The cousin will think she's with her uncle. The uncle will continue to believe she's in the care of the cousin, and she'll be off with her lover. This letter stands alone. We know nothing more about their relationship. However, their daughter, Constance Paston, may have been conceived at this meeting. Constance's father, John Paston too, died in November of the next year, 1479, in London, probably of plague. We have not been able to trace Constance Renifrew at all. We have no knowledge of who she was or what happened to her. She may have been a member of the Rainsford family of Bradfield in Suffolk, though we have no definite proof of this. She may have died as a result of the childbirth. She may have died of plague, which was extremely bad that year, or for disgracing her family with a child born out of wedlock. She may have been banished from her family and forced to enter a nunnery, and all trace of her lost. However, her baby daughter survived. The baby daughter was called Constance, and she was probably born in 1479. And Constance, little Constance, would have been 2 or 3 years old when she appears in 1482 in the will of her paternal grandmother, Margaret Mautby Paston. We refer to her as Margaret Mautby Paston, though at the time she'd have been known as Margaret Paston. We put the Mautby in just to remind people of what family she came from. Now, Margaret, Constance's grandmother, she was an important member of the family. She was probably the person who was responsible for collecting the Paston letters together, and 104 letters from Margaret survive. So, in her will, Margaret wrote, "I bequeath to Constance, bastard daughter of John Paston, knight, when she is 20 years of age, 10 marks. The word bastard had no pejorative implications at the time. It simply meant born out of wedlock or illegitimate. This entry appears amongst bequests to Margaret's other grandchildren and is in no way different from them, though her legitimate cousins, whose names come before her in the will, William and Elizabeth, were left considerably more money. Both Elizabeth and William were left 50 marks, or £33 6 and 8 pence, whereas Constance's gift of 10 marks, or £6 13 and 4 pence, is considerably less, though of course worth a great deal more then than now. This money for Constance when she's 20 is almost certainly meant as marriage money to provide Constance, an illegitimate orphaned child, with a dowry. Now, this is the only place where little Constance is named in the Paston letters, and nothing more was known of her until now. She had disappeared from the record. However, my next discovery tells us more. This is another of the Paston letters. We can't date the letter exactly, but we know that it was written between 1495 and 1500, when Constance was in her late teens. So the will was when she was 2 or 3. Now she's in her late teens. The letter is to Constance's uncle, John Paston III, the younger brother of her father, and it's from Sir John Kendall, who was prior of the Knights of St. John Clerkenwell. The letter doesn't mention Constance by name, only, as it is addressed to her uncle, John Paston III, it refers to your niece, which is probably why it has evaded notice. I have reproduced the letter's contents here, with modernized spelling. So Sir John Kendall writes, I was minded that my cousin Clipsby, bearer hereof, should well have married here in these parts, wherein your niece took heavy conceit, thinking in her mind that I was not willing that my said cousin should marry with her. At that time, I knew not what love was betwixt them. Briefly to explain who these people are, my cousin Clipsby is John Clipsby. He is a young man who had been the ward of Edmund Paston, Constance's uncle, and also he was Edmund Paston's stepson. And Constance had probably known him all her life because her uncle and his stepfather were brothers. John Clipsby was the heir to the estate of Oby in Norfolk, and he had apparently recently come of age, so was in a position to marry. So he's 21, he's inherited the estate of Oby because he's 21, he's in a position to marry, and his kinsman, Sir John Kendall, who was in fact also a kinsman of the Pastons, is suggesting that he should marry here in these parts, perhaps London. At which, as the letter tells us, John Paston's niece took heavy conceit, became very upset, thinking that Sir John was suggesting that young Clipsby should marry somebody other than her when she and young Clipsby were in love. We know, in fact, that your niece is Constance because other evidence, which I'll show you later, proves, in fact, that John Clipsby did, in fact, marry Constance Paston. So, when Sir John Kendall understood the situation, that the two of them were in love, I'm going on with reading the letter, but now I understand that both their minds is to marry together, whereunto, on my part, I am agreeable and well content, desiring and praying you to be the same. And I pray you to recommend me to my cousin, your niece. So Sir John Kendall recommends that the two young people be allowed to marry, and he encourages John Paston III to agree, which we know he did. Now, this letter was for me a really important find because up until we found it, we assumed that Constance's marriage to John Clipsby was an arranged thing. She being an adopted illegitimate child, and he being her uncle's ward. This discovery demonstrates that, unlike almost all the other young Paston women, Constance was allowed to marry the man that she loved. It contrasts completely with the treatment that the Pastons usually meted out to their young women folk. Usually the Pastons forced them to marry husbands of whom the family approved, husbands who would raise the Paston family's status. Constance's great aunt, Elizabeth Paston, had been locked up and beaten by her mother, Agnes, to persuade her to marry an elderly, disabled, but well-connected widower. Constance's Aunt Anne had been deliberately separated from the man she loved, and her Aunt Marjorie was completely ostracized by the family for contracting a secret marriage to one of their employees. Constance really was very lucky. And this may have been the one advantage of her being illegitimate. Her marriage simply didn't matter. And wedding her to a respectable young gentleman who was local and who loved her was certainly good enough and didn't require much dowry. The Pastons were famously mean with their money. Also, Constance may have been very pretty. We have no way of knowing this as fact, but it does seem very likely. Her father, John Paston too, is referred to by a friend in the Paston letters as the best chooser of a gentlewoman, implying that he was a handsome man who could take his pick. Constance's mother, Constance Renifrew, was probably one of the women he picked, probably a very attractive young woman. And her daughter, maybe, was the same. The final phrase in Sir John Kendall's letter is also interesting. Though this is a standard phrase, I pray you recommend me to my cousin, your niece. It's a standard phrase like we might say, give my best wishes to your wife. But it does imply that Constance is part of her uncle's household. It suggests that despite her illegitimacy, Constance had been adopted by her uncle and had been brought up as a member of his family. There are brief references in some other Paston letters which suggest that she was not the first illegitimate child fathered by a young male member of the Paston circle, who was brought up, taken in, and raised by the family. Indeed, 3 of Margaret Paston's 5 sons appears to have had a bastard child. And these children seem to have been cared for by the women of the family. Child mortality in the Middle Ages was so high that probably any child of the family who survived was precious. Margaret, that is Margaret the grandmother, Margaret had a cousin, Osbert Burney, who was the illegitimate son of her uncle, John Burney, and the Pastons always looked after him, and he fought for them when the Duke of Norfolk besieged Caister Castle in 1469. Osbert Burney's monumental brass survives still in Braidstone Church. It appears that Constance's uncle, John Paston III, when he was a very young man, fathered a base-born son called Jack, who was cared for by Margaret, John's mother, but who did not survive childhood. Fascinatingly, Edmund Paston, that is Constance's uncle and the stepfather of young Clipsby, Edmund Paston, also fathered a child, this time by a married woman, Mistress Dixon. But he was refused permission to take the child by the king because the woman's husband was alive. All these examples suggest that if a father chose, he could take his illegitimate child from the mother, regardless of her feelings. And this may have been what happened to Constance Renifrew. So, if, as Sir John Kendall's letter strongly suggests, Constance's uncle John Paston III had adopted and raised her, then in fact she fell on her feet, because his was a happy family. His marriage to Marjorie Bruce was a rare thing in medieval gentry circles. It was a love match. Marjorie had written him 2 love letters before their marriage. These 2 are famous letters, known as the Valentine letters. And even some years later, 4 years into the marriage, Marjorie Bruce Paston was addressing John III in a letter as mine own sweetheart. And on one occasion, when John III had been away from home for some time, Marjorie added a postscript to the letter asking that if he planned to stay longer in London, he would send for her. And she added, "For I think it long since I lay in your arms." So this happy couple had married in 1477, and their first child, Christopher, had been born in the summer of 17, did I say 17? 14, I said 17, didn't I? Did I? Never mind. They were married in 1477, and their first child, Christopher, was born in the summer of 1478. But Christopher was dead by 1482 because he does not appear in his grandmother's will. And if he'd been alive, he would have. Constance, who was probably taken into the family in 1479, most likely was very close in age to her second born cousin, William. And perhaps Constance was the eldest child. She was certainly the eldest girl in John III's family. So she was effectively the big sister to John III's growing brood of children. Recent research has revealed that she had 5 younger cousins who survived to adulthood. William and Elizabeth, who were in the grandmother's will, also Philip, Philippa, and Dorothy. However, we know that John III had at least 3 children who did not survive childhood, child mortality being so high. So understandable that Constance was cherished. Because I'm here in Norwich, I thought I'd just share with you this fascinating picture of Norwich in 1479. This is the year that Constance was born, and this phrase appears in one of the Paston letters. It was a year of plague, not unlike the conditions that we've had to put up with recently. In November 1479, I think I haven't modernized the spelling much here. In November 1479, Constance's uncle, John III, wrote to his elder brother, Constance's father, John II, in London, and possibly John II never received this letter, for he died, probably of plague, in the same month. John III asked his brother to send from London 2 pots of treacle, which was a potion which they thought had medicinal properties. But he added, "The people dieth sore in Norwich, and especially about my house. But my wife and my women come not out. And flee further we cannot. For at Swainsthorpe," this was John III's country estate, "at Swainsthorpe, since my departing thence, they have died and been sick, nigh in every house in the town." The medicine that John III requested from London, he says, is for my young wife, my young folks, and myself. He doesn't say my wife and children, rather my wife and young folks, which suggests to me that the infants in his care may not have all been his own offspring, may perhaps have included his niece, Constance. Constance did marry John Clipsby, and she would have been Lady of the Manor of Oby in Norfolk, which appears on this map. To the far left, we have the coast, sea coast, and Yarmouth, and Norwich is to the right. We're right over near the coast. So Lady of the Manor of Oby, and they had perhaps 4 children who survived to adulthood, though I have only one source for this, and it's a rather unreliable source, so I'm not totally sure that that's reliable, that she had 4 children. Our next definite evidence of Constance's life is to be found in these extracts from an essay towards a topographical history of Norfolk by Francis Bloomfield, who was an 18th century antiquarian, which was first published by him in 1739. Now, Bloomfield was working from legal documents, and I haven't found the actual source of these documents, but this is what Bloomfield says, and they are Bloomfield, who is writing in the 18th century, he's quoting from legal documents of the time. And so we have the first extract of 1515. It says, in the 6th of Henry VIII, 1515 that is, Thomas, Duke of Norfolk, Great Marshal and Treasurer of England, granted to William Paston and Constance, widow of John Clipsby, Esquire, the wardship and custody of the lands of William Clipsby, son and heir of John Clipsby, deceased. So here we have in 1515, the death of Constance's husband, John Clipsby. Constance would have been aged about 36, and the William Paston who appears here is her cousin William, helping her, now a widow, to keep the wardship of her underage son, William Clipsby, and to keep control of the family's land. William Paston, as we know, was the eldest surviving son of her uncle John Paston III, very close in age to Constance, and probably brought up with her, effectively her brother. The fact that she was being helped, that we have in this legal document, the evidence that she was being helped by a Paston, seems again to confirm that Constance herself was a Paston. And the second extract moves us on to 1526, when they grant to the said William, now the they here is Constance and her cousin William again, they grant to the said William, that's her son, Constance's son, the benefit of his marriage for the virtuous manners and good conditions which he hath used to the said Constance, his mother. So this is Constance, aged about 47, widowed Constance, still being supported by her cousin William, giving her eldest son William the freedom to marry, and presumably some of the income from the estate, even though her son William is still underage. He wouldn't have had the freedom to marry until he was 21. So we can assume he's about 19 or 20, and he's met the girl he wants to marry. And though he isn't free to make that marriage unless he has the permission of his guardians, here they are giving him that permission, because he's been such a supportive son to Constance. It also suggests that Constance had good relationships with her children. And William did indeed marry soon. He married Lettice Knightley. She was the daughter of William Knightley, who was a Norwich lawyer. The next slide moves us on to a section of a will. And this is the will of Constance's son, William. We've moved on to 1540. And if Constance were alive, she'd be 61. So this '30s, and he probably died unexpectedly. His mother, Constance, is not mentioned in the will at all. And this suggests to me, it's not fact, but it suggests to me that she was probably dead before this will was written, before she reached the age of 61. So we don't know exactly when Constance died. She probably died in her 50s, but this was a normal lifespan at the time. If she had been alive, William might have named her as an executor. Instead, the will states, 2 lines from the bottom, starting here, I make Lettice, my wife, and John, my son, to dispose and order this my testament and last will. Now, John, that is Constance's grandson, John, the son of her son, William, he could only have been about 13. I think if Constance had been alive, he would have named her as an executor. However, young John is crucial to the story because it was his monumental brass, which you see over there on the left, which began this research. At a Paston conference in Great Yarmouth in the summer of 2019, I simply happened to sit next to Mrs. Jane Lindsay, who's a churchwarden at St. Peter's, Clipsby. And she showed me that drawing, that's John Sell Cotman's drawing of the monumental brass in the church at Clipsby. The shield down to the bottom, I'm saying left, I'm not sure it says me, I'm probably saying left and right, completely wrong for you. Who knows? Down the bottom corner, the shield down in the bottom far corner has, on the right-hand side, which is the woman's side, women are always right. You just think to yourself when you look at shields, women are always right. On the right-hand side, it has the Paston arms. That is 6 fleur-de-lis below a gold strip with a toothed bottom edge. And looking at it at the conference, we were sitting there and I thought, oh, it's Constance. This has to be Constance. On the other side, you see on the left-hand side, or on the left-hand side, they're all the same. Those are all Clipsbys. On the right-hand side of each of these shields are women who married into the Clipsby family. And I realized that that represented a Paston woman who married a Clipsby man. And there's a couple of historians of the Paston letters, Colin Richmond and Roger Virgo. And I'd seen a note in one of Colin Richmond's books. It was recording what Virgo had said. Virgo said that a John Clipsby married an unsurnamed Constance. And I immediately thought, this must be Constance Paston, the illegitimate daughter of John Paston II, and the grandmother of the John Clipsby on the brass. And though I'm ending here, this is the Paston, there she is, reproduced larger here. I'm ending here, but this is in fact where my research started. This was the beginning. I saw this and I thought, this has to be Constance. So once I had located her at Clipsby and realized that she had lived and died at Clipsby, Oby and Clipsby, finding more evidence was straightforward. Looking into Bloomfield, I could find those references to her. Now, ironically, if John too had married Constance Reniforth before she had the baby, young Constance, she would have been the heir to all the Paston lands and all the Paston money. But because Constance was illegitimate, she couldn't inherit. However, my research has discovered that from an unpromising start, a baby who was female, illegitimate, orphaned, Constance Paston was acknowledged by the Paston family. She was taken in and brought up by her uncle and allowed to marry for love. She seems to have enjoyed good relationships with her husband, with her cousins, with her children. Overall, a successful life for a medieval woman. Thank you.